Hello everyone and welcome to today's device cast on IPL physiology and how IPL and lasers compare. So the principles of light therapy. So when we are working with IPLs, with lasers, with LEDs, most of the time we are working with the visible light spectrum, and this is the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, every color has a specific nanometer correlation, so it has a specific wavelength that correlates. It has a different density, a different weight, a different depth that it penetrates into the skin, and it will aim generally for a different chromophore or a different target. So different colors of light and different lights react and penetrate the skin differently. Now, it's really important for us to know this because depending on what IPL or laser we choose, what wavelength or color light we choose is going to vary what we can use that machine for. So it's really important to understand what you would like that IPL or laser to do and what wavelengths you might need in order to achieve that. For example, if you have a lot of acne clients, you are going to need a color or a wavelength that treats acne. If you deal with a lot of anti-aging, you are going to need a wavelength or a color that penetrates deep in the skin, down to collagen and elastin, and treats that concern. Using a IPL or a laser that treats acne isn't necessarily going to treat collagen. So knowing what wavelengths do what is going to be really important to understand what kind of machine you will need for your treatment room. So again, that visible light spectrum is a very small sliver of our electromagnetic spectrum. To its right, you will see things like infrared that also is used for things like LEDs and also for lasers as well. You'll also see microwaves next to it, and going along, these are, and the visible light spectrum is non-ionizing radiation. And non-ionizing radiation does not have the ability to change or mutate a cell. It cannot change cellular DNA or structure and therefore cannot cause cancer. So these are completely safe to use on skin cells. Everything to the left of that visible light spectrum is our ultraviolet, our X-rays, and so on. These are our ionizing radiations, and these are the ones with prolonged exposure that can change cellular DNA and cause issues such as cancer and mutations. So again, that left-hand side is the ones that we have in small dosages and avoid. To our right, we have our visible light spectrum, infrared, and so on, which are completely safe. Now again, even LEDs fall under this visible light spectrum. Back in the day, it used to be photon machines or UV machines, and they used to include things like ultraviolet. Well, LEDs, IPLs, and lasers no longer include ultraviolet light as part of their treatment, and therefore are completely safe to use. Now, as I said before, the wavelength or the color that you choose to operate with will depend on the depth of penetration and what you are focusing on in the skin. Shorter wavelengths, such as what we can see here, 420, 530, they are very superficially penetrating. Think of them almost like a slinky. So if I take a slinky and bunch it up together, those rolls are highly frequent. They're very often and very, very close together. This makes those wavelengths very strong. They have a very strong melanin attraction and aren't often good for darker skin types such as your fits 5s and 6s. If I take that slinky that is tightly compact and I turn it this way, it only goes this deep. It is very superficially penetrating. And what that means is it's going to target more of our superficial concerns. So a 420 wavelength, for example, is often used to treat acne. A 530 is generally used to treat pigmentation issues such as freckles. So again, that's superficially sitting pigmentation. If I get that slinky and I stretch it out, those rolls are now less frequent. It's a low frequency wavelength. It makes it more gentle, it penetrates into the skin deeper, and it's going to become more suitable for your darker skin types because of that gentleness and that less attraction to melanin as well. If I take that slinky and I turn it this way, it's going to go really nice and deep. So here's going to be better for hair removal, getting down to that bulb, going to be better at focusing on papillary issues, so broken capillaries and inflammation, diffuse redness, and it's also going to be better for collagen elastin production as well, such as our photorejuvenation. So depending on what wavelength we choose is going to depend on where we're targeting in the skin and what we're actually trying to target in the skin. So light, when it interacts with the skin, does a few different things. First of all, when we introduce light to the skin, there will always be some reflection, regardless of what machine we use. Light will always reflect somewhat off our skin. Now, the more dry skin a person has, the more white keratinized cells they have on the surface of their skin, the more reflection we will have, because white refracts light. This means if you're doing something like hair removal on the knees, this can be quite hard to achieve an amazing result because the light will bounce off. Whereas the shins, the thighs, everywhere else that we've been treating will respond really well. And a lot of clients will come back and go, my knees still require more treatment. They would need to exfoliate and moisturize and try to get that skin supple so that light can penetrate a lot better. It's also an amazing way to boost your treatment because if you exfoliate, remove those dead keratinized cells, more light is going to be able to penetrate through. Now, regardless of machine, again, we are going to see some kind of scatter. IPL has more of a scatter than a laser. A laser is a beam of light, so think almost like your laser pointer. It keeps going and going and going until it reaches a target, and it has a very small spot size. It's very specific. What this means is it will react once it hits that target. If we're treating something like freckles, for example, this can be quite useful because it will target just that freckle that it sees on the surface. It won't really scatter beyond that. There's a small amount that does, but not a lot. For IPL, however, there is a lot of scatter. Think almost like a flashlight, and it will pick up on things in the area. So again, if we're treating pigmentation with IPL, what we often see is not only a clearing of that superficial freckle that we can see on the surface, but that scatter will also get that yellowy undertone in the skin and potentially some of the freckles underlying. So if we are using the right wavelength and the right energy, if we want more of an overarching treatment, we want to clear up the yellowy undertone, the freckles, the pigment, IPL is actually a better option. If we want to be a lot more targeted and we want to get one thing and one thing only, this is where our laser comes in because he's very pinpoint, he's very, very direct. So it also begs the question to which one do you prefer? Do you have clients that have more targeted concerns that require a laser? Or do you have clients that have more overarching concerns such as pigmentation on a whole or vascular lesions on a whole? Perhaps IPL is going to be better for you there. Last but not least, we have absorption. Now, absorption is what we aim for when we do treatments. It is the most important because if our target is not absorbing that light energy, it means our treatment will not work. So when we're looking at something like hair removal, we need that hair to absorb the majority of that light. And this is what's going to create that heat energy that is going to destroy that hair for us. Think almost like plants and photosynthesis. The light comes in, they take that light and that heat energy and they convert it into food and energy. Our skin does the same thing. So depending on what our chromophore is, whether it is hair, whether it is pigment, we need that light to be converted into energy in order to make sure that that treatment works. So if this isn't happening, we will end up with not so good treatment, or we may be affecting the surrounding tissue instead of just that target. So what targets can we aim for in the skin. The chromophores that we look at targeting are things like our P. acne bacteria, our melanin in the superficial layers of our skin, so in our epidermis, such as freckles, age spots, and the like. Blood for our capillaries, our diffuse redness, water for photorejuvenation. It's actually water that we aim for in the skin. And we also aim for the melanin in the bulb of the hair, so that nice deep melanin that sits in the bulb there. So again, depending on our chromophore, depends on what wavelength we are choosing, how much energy we need, and where we're aiming for in the skin. So this process is a process called selective photothermolysis. So selective meaning we're targeting something specifically, photo meaning light, thermo meaning heat, and lysis meaning death. So we're using light and heat to selectively target something and destroy it. Now the aim, whether we're using an IPL or a laser, is to cause unit target destruction to that chromophore, that target, without harming the surrounding tissue. And this is what we aim for regardless. So what variants do we have of this? What considerations do we have to take? Number one, different wavelengths are absorbed by different chromophores. An acne wavelength is not going to target our collagen and elastin. So it's really important that we're choosing the right wavelength. We need the right energy versus the length of pulse. What I mean by this is we can't sit you under an LED and expect to remove your hair. LED's energy is spaced out over a 20-30 minute period. With your lasers and IPLs, they work in milliseconds. And it's this that we need generally to cause that unit target destruction. So we need the right amount of energy, but we need it delivered in the right way. Another way to think about it is swinging an axe at a log. The axe is always going to cut the log, but it depends on how fast I swing it as to whether I'm going to achieve what I need to achieve. If I slowly swing it, I might damage the log a little bit, but I'm certainly not going to split it in half. So it's really important that that length of pulse is correct so that we're getting that energy delivered properly to our chromophore. Now, generally the target does need to reach 70 degrees of heat. Now, do let that sink in, 70 degrees of heat. It is really important that clients understand the seriousness of both laser and IPL treatments. Because they are so flooded in the market now, clients are very blasé about their treatments. They don't undertake proper pre-care and aftercare, and this is why we see a lot of reactions with both. So it's really important to educate your clients. I'm putting 70 degrees of heat into your hair. That is very, very hot. And this is why your energy settings are really important, because we want to put as much heat as we can into, say, that hair, but we don't want that 70 degrees of heat going into your skin. If it leaves the hair and goes into your skin, that is when we see things like burns or discolorations and crusting. And we don't want any of that to happen. So test patching is super duper important, and also post-care as well. 70 degrees of heat can linger in the skin for up to 72 hours. So if you are looking to introduce a IPL or a laser into your clinic, I would always recommend having a post-treatment care, whether it is part of your current product range or if it's one that we can supply to you. Absolutely having that on hand as aftercare is really, really important to ensure the success of your treatments. Now, the larger something is, the longer it takes to cool down. So think about if I set fire to that log that I was trying to cut before. If I set fire to it, it burns very easily, it burns very bright, very hot, and if I leave it for hours, it will continue to smolder, it will continue to generate heat. If I burn a twig, however, it will go up in flames, it will turn into ash, no more twig. And it is exactly the same when we're targeting things in the skin. If I am targeting a log or a big, thick, dark hair with lots of pigment in it, really thick, if I'm targeting someone with a lot of freckles or really dark freckles, if I'm targeting lots of capillary activity, this is going to generate a lot of that 70 degrees of heat, and it's going to continue to smolder. They're going to feel heat after the treatment. It might be a bit swollen, a bit red. That's super normal. If I'm dealing with someone with a light hair or with really light freckles, maybe one particular age spot singularly, that's not going to produce a lot of heat. Now, what that means is I need a great amount of energy to put into that hair, to put into that pigment, to ensure it gets to the same amount of heat as that log. So when we start our treatments, generally our energies will be quite low because that hair will absorb that heat. Alternative to this, if we've got someone with really thin, fine hair, maybe they've gotten further along in their treatments, we're going to have to use a lot more energy. So this is important because depending on the machine that you choose, you want to make sure that it's got a variable enough energy that you can treat all clients, whether they have thick hair, thin hair, lots of pigment, little pigment, whatever you're aiming for. But you also want to make sure that you are going to be able to carry your client throughout all of their treatments. So that energy needs to be variable. So let's look at the main differences between IPL and laser. Now, a lot of you might not know that laser actually stands for something. So IPL stands for intense pulse light. Our laser stands for light amplification by stimulating emission of radiation. So if we look at the main differences, we have our polychromatic is our IPL. What we mean by polychromatic, so if we think of polyamorous, we have several partners. With our IPL, we have several filters. And what this allows us to do is change the wavelength that we're working with. So we are actually able to choose a 420 wavelength, a 530 wavelength, a 640 wavelength, and change what that IPL is capable of doing. Some IPLs as well have the ability to change handpiece, and that handpiece will change depending on what you are treating. Lasers, however, they're built in. Their wavelength is generally part of the machine and it cannot be changed. It cannot be altered. There are a few machines now that have multiple wavelengths inbuilt, such as an alexandrite and an Nd:YAG. But once you have an alexandrite or an Nd:YAG, you cannot change it. And that is because it is crystal technology. There are crystals inside the machine, alexandrite crystals, diode crystals, that dictate the wavelength of that machine, and you can't change them, they're inbuilt. Our filters, however, slot in and out, or if it's a handpiece change, that's very easy to swap out. This means your laser is one treatment generally and one treatment only, or maybe one or two treatments depending on the wavelengths that you have, whereas IPL can treat a multitude of concerns. Your IPL has that scattered light, as we spoke about before, whereas your laser is very coherent and it is very targeted. Your IPL has a larger spot size. So this larger spot size is actually able to penetrate deeper into the skin, which complements that scatter quite nicely. With lasers, when we need to build up energy, we need the spot size to continue to get smaller, and that's going to dictate how much scatter we get and that depth of penetration almost. I know that's a little bit confusing, but what I mean by that is if we have a bigger spot size, it's going to go deeper, which you can use with a laser. But as you go along, you're going to have to make that spot size smaller. So again, it's going to be going less into the skin. And the reason for that is because it doesn't have that scatter. It doesn't have that range, that, you know, those little legs that will go through the skin. It's very targeted. So you have to dictate that spot size as to how deep you want to go into the skin. And generally smaller spot sizes are a bit more powerful. So they're the ones you would want to use. That's going to be a bit more superficial. Your IPLs are non-ablative. So what I mean by that is IPLs are never going to be used during surgeries or to cut the skin. IPLs are also never going to be used for things like tattoo removal. They don't operate fast enough and they're not targeted enough to cut the skin. Lasers, however, can. So lasers can be used for eye surgeries, to cut the skin, and they can be ablative. Now, this is a point I actually bring up a lot because a lot of people have the idea that lasers are actually a lot safer than an IPL. Lasers are ablative, IPLs are not. So yes, while both of them treat, let's say for example, hair removal, IPL is not safer than a laser, and a laser really isn't safer than an IPL. Both of them have the ability to burn the skin. However, if we look at the severity in which they can burn the skin, it's actually probably about the same. However, if you are using a certain laser, one that is tissue ablative and able to remove skin, then potentially, yes, that burn will be a lot worse. It will be a lot harder to heal. An IPL, it may have been a lot more superficial. So one actually isn't safer than the other. A laser can be ablative, very hot, very targeted, very, very direct, and if used incorrectly, can burn somebody. An IPL has a lot more scatter, goes through the skin, has a deeper penetration, and can also burn someone in the wrong hands. One is not safer than the other. Both technologies are amazing. However, it is still recommended that you follow the treatment parameters and you're sensible when operating either device. Your IPL has a xenon flash lamp. This will deteriorate over time. Now, your xenon flash lamp is actually found within the handpiece of your device. What this means is that if something should deteriorate, if something should shut down on you, it generally isn't a machine issue, which means you can change the handpiece. You can use a different handpiece or you can swap the handpiece out. This means it's a lot easier to get back to work, choose an alternative handpiece, and it also means the maintenance is a lot less. Your laser, however, works on crystals and glass and fiber optics, which are built into the machine. The components are a little bit more expensive. It requires calibration, which means you need to turn your machine on 20 minutes prior to beginning a treatment for a lot of machines. And it also means that those components can overheat and break easily as well, and they're inbuilt into the machine, which generally means if you have a component stop, you need to stop operation with the entire machine until someone comes and fixes it. So both have their pros and their cons. Laser needs a little bit more maintenance, IPL doesn't. IPL has a lot more scatter, laser is a lot more direct. So depending on which one is sounding better for your clinic is the one that you will go with. So this is this energy and intensity and that length of pulse that I was talking about before. When we look at a laser, it is very short and sharp. That short and sharp pulse, that swing of that axe is very quick. That gives us the ability to use lasers for things like tattoo removal, for ablative, cutting the skin. It can be used for hair removal and pigment still. It can vary depending on the type of laser machine that we have. On the other end of that, we have our LED. Now, our LED operates very slowly, so over 20, 30 minutes of time. This takes that time to build up that energy. So LED energy builds over time. It is never going to be short and sharp enough in order to remove hair, to burn skin. It doesn't have that capability. IPL sits somewhat in the middle. So it has a decent length of pulse, and this allows us to do photothermal reactions, but it's never going to be fast enough to cut the skin or do tattoo removal. Then we have something called SHR. Now, SHR can be found in our IPL machine, but also in our diode laser as well. What it does is it takes one pulse of that laser or that IPL and it chops it up into smaller bits. So say, for example, if one pulse gave us 10 joules of energy, and we're working with 10 energy, it's going to break it down into 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, and break it up with a little break in between. We call that thermal relaxation time. And this allows us to do something like sweep across the skin like this and treat larger areas. Because we're building up that heat gradually and eventually getting to that 10 joules of heat, we're also able to not only treat those bigger areas, but we're able to treat darker skin types more safely. And it also reduces the pain because they're not getting that full heat in one pulse. They're getting it across multiple pulses. And this allows us, again, to treat bigger areas quickly, effectively, and with less pain. So the things we need to look at when we think about our IPL and our lasers, these are our parameters. So our parameters dictate what we need to chop, change, and alter in order to get the best treatment possible. So we have our filters, our energy can change, our pulse width, our repetition rate, how quick the device fires, cooling, spot size, and also what skin type can we treat. Now our energy. So our energy is always measured in joules. Now again, as hair becomes finer, as pigmentation lightens, as vessels become smaller, energy will need to go up. Now back when I originally started, I worked with an IPL machine that went from 1 to 6. 1 being the weakest and 6 being the highest. I didn't actually know what joules of energy I was working with, and once you got to 6, you couldn't go any higher. Now these days, a machine like that is fairly obsolete. Back in the day, it was amazing, but now we want to know what energy we're working with. We want to be able to increase it. We want to be able to, not start at 3 and max out at 6. We want to start at 10 and go all the way to 50. So depending on what machine you're looking at, always have a look at that energy and how high you can get it. Where's the max? Where do the machine manufacturers recommend you stop? So that you understand what kind of treatment course you can work with and that you have variable energy levels over time. Spot size. So spot size again determines our depth of penetration. A smaller spot size again will be more superficial. A larger spot size will go a lot deeper. Now if we have a small spot size, it will not penetrate deep enough. The energy is also going to be tightly compact, which means we've got 10 joules of energy, not spaced out here, but really tightly compact. So that 10 joules is all in there, which makes that a lot stronger. So if you're working with something with a smaller spot size, it is a bit more targeted. It is a lot stronger, but also it doesn't penetrate as deep, depending on what you need it for. Too large can sometimes mean you bypass the target. It also might diffuse the energy. So knowing what spot size is appropriate for your treatment is going to allow you to vary that over time, to manipulate your spot size over time so that you are able to penetrate where you need to penetrate. For example, the original hair removal laser was a ruby laser. Now a ruby laser uses a 500, 600 nanometer wavelength, and it has a very, very small spot size. Now, if we look at that wavelength, it's very superficial and very, very strong. So again, if we're trying to target the bulb of a hair, it's not going to go deep enough. And it's got a very, very small spot size, which again isn't going to allow for a lot of scatter, not a lot of diffusing. It's going to be very superficial. So nowadays, a ruby is actually used for removal of freckles or pigmentation, because again, that wavelength dictates that depth and its spot size is very small, which complements that. So depending on what you're treating will depend on what spot size you would like to use. Then we have our pulse width. Now our pulse width dictates the length of time a pulse is emitted. I call it cooking time. If I have a big, fat, juicy chicken and I pop him in the oven and I crank the heat for 5 minutes, I'm probably going to burn the outside and not cook through to the middle and cook the contents. The same can be said for any kind of IPL and laser treatments. If we're using too short a pulse width, what can end up happening is that heat doesn't cook through that thick hair, it doesn't go through that dark skin safely, and it's not going to achieve the result that we want. It may not get to that hair, it might get that skin, which we also don't want. If we've got a short target or a small target, such as our thin, fine hair, it would be like me getting a leg of that chicken and doing the same thing. It would cook well, it would cook all the way through. So if we've got a lighter skin client, or if we've got someone with a very thin, fine hair, we can use that shorter, sharp cooking time and cook it all the way through. What we have here is also called a pulse train. So you'll see there's that energy and then there's a gap. Then there's that energy and then there's a gap. That gap or that lull is a thermal relaxation time gap. When we fire a laser or an IPL, to the naked eye, it's one flash. If we slowed that down, you actually see multiple flashes, and this is a pulse train. Not only is understanding what that pulse width is important, but also that thermal relaxation time, because that skin gets a little bit of a break between those pulses. If we have a darker skin, we would need a longer thermal relaxation time, because that skin needs a second to deal with that trauma so that it doesn't pigment. A dark skin tans very easy, so if we cause lots of trauma to it very quickly, it can pigment and it can potentially scar. So we need a nice long thermal relaxation time for it to go, oh, that's okay, and again, oh, that's okay, and again. And that's going to ensure the safety of our treatment. Now, for some machines, this is variable and you'll be able to change this. On others, this will be preset for you. But it's just nice to know that what's going on with your device and why pulse width is necessary. Now, cooling systems are very important because cooling allows for more delivery of energy while keeping that superficial skin safe. When we do things like hair removal, it's really important to introduce lots of cooling because we're using a deep wavelength, potentially lots of heat, but we want to keep that epidermal skin cool. So we want lots of cooling on the surface of the skin and have that heat radiate down. This is also going to help keep darker skin safe and also reduce pain and side effects. Now, some machines will have inbuilt cooling, such as our Lux series. However, some machines will require you to buy a separate device or cryogen. So cryogen is a gas. It is warmer than nitrogen, so safer on the skin. However, that will fire when the laser fires, or you will need a Zimmer cooler which blows cold air. So it may need an additional purchase of more equipment depending on the device that you get. And then we have skin type. It's really important when choosing a device what type of skin type you have in your clinic and what is going to suit your clients best. If you are in an area that has predominantly fits 4-5 clients, then unfortunately using shorter wavelengths and really strong devices may not be suitable for your clinic. Now, stronger doesn't always mean better. When I say stronger, I mean a higher melanin absorption. So that's going to be more suitable for a fits 1, 2, 3. Again, if you've got 4-5s in your clinic, you're going to need a longer wavelength. You're going to need something that's a bit more variable. So it's really important to decide if a client is suitable for that treatment at all and what treatment settings you are going to need to use in order to treat that client. So these are things to consider when going for the purchase of your machine. Is it going to allow you to treat all the clients that you have walking in the door, or is it more specific to someone else? So which one is right for my business? Look, I've worked with both over the years and both are fantastic. However, when we look at, let's say, our Lux series, our IPL, our Ultra Lux or our Ultra Lux Pro, in comparison to our hair layers, our IPL is also able to treat things like skin concerns. It has wavelengths that suit hair removal all the way through to skin conditions. So depending on what we need the laser for, or the IPL for, sorry, will depend on what we're treating. Our hair laser only operates hair. It is a diode laser and it will only treat hair removal. It cannot and will not treat skin concerns. So we are a clinic that is dedicated to hair removal. Something like the hair laser is going to be fantastic. Now, both of our devices have SHR capability. They're able to do that sweeping and it's able to treat very large areas over a very short space of time. It makes it more comfortable for the client and it does make it easier to treat darker skin types. Your IPL has a large spot size to assist with that scatter, whereas your laser has a small spot size to allow it to be more targeted and focus on that chromophore. Our IPL can treat all the way up to fits 5 for hair removal, whereas our laser goes to fits 6. So depending on the clients that you have. Both are safe and effective, and both have inbuilt cooling. So both have inbuilt cooling systems. No calibration is needed for our IPL, and for some lasers, gel is optional. For our hair lasers, gel is absolutely optional. For some lasers, there is no gel needed. So if this is an extra consumable for you, you may like to consider that as an option as well. Now again, our hair laser has inbuilt cooling, but some lasers again do need that additional cooling mechanism such as a Zimmer cooler, so also important to keep in mind. All right, guys, that wraps us up for today. This is our phone number for both Australia, New Zealand, and the US. We also have our email there, so if you have any questions, queries, or concerns that you would like to go through privately, please email us at info@theglobalbeautygroup.com. Or if you want to check out more of our devices, you can do so via theglobalbeautygroup.com.